Good evening, everyone. Today is Monday, December 13th, 2021, and welcome and thank you for joining us for our third community meeting on the Arlington County and Montgomery County Joint Aircraft Noise Mitigation Study. My name is Rich Roisman. I'm the study manager from Arlington County, and I will be your host and moderator this evening. I'm pleased to be joined tonight by my counterpart in Montgomery County, Ken Hartman, and most importantly, our local elected officials, Arlington County Board Member Libby Garvey, Arlington County Board Member Takis Karantonis, and Montgomery County Council Member Andrew Friedson. I also want to recognize other elected officials or representatives of elected officials joining us for tonight's meeting. Michael Porcella from the Office of District of Columbia City Councilwoman Mary Che, Brett Gerard from Senator Van Hollen's office, and Nina Weisbroth from Congressman Raskin's office. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Tonight's meeting is so we can get your feedback of the study in general and on the departure procedures currently under review by the Northup Airport Committee of the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority Community Working Group, which consists of community members of Arlington, Montgomery, Fairfax counties, and the District of Columbia appointed by their respective governing bodies. A reminder to everyone that this meeting is being live streamed, so people should feel encouraged to let their neighbors and friends know to join in. If you're watching us tonight on Facebook Live, we'll be taking your comments and questions on Facebook in the chat window into our holding area for distribution to the panelists after the presentation. If you're watching us over YouTube or Arlington Cable Television, you may call or text your questions to the following telephone number, 571-348-3053. You should also see the number on the bottom part of your screen as we're broadcasting. After the presentation from the study team, I will read out your questions and direct them to one of our panelists. But before the presentation, I wanted to provide the opportunity for everyone to hear some introductory remarks and background on the study from our board members and council members. Before I get to the council members, let me give some of the background information on my own. Many of you here tonight have been following the issue of airplane noise impacting our communities and were with us when we first kicked off the aircraft noise mitigation study at our first community meeting for this study in August 2020. Just as a refresher, and as background for anyone who wasn't able to join us for the two previous community meetings, Arlington and Montgomery counties joined together to hire an airspace expert to help us gather data and consider new flight paths and procedures to mitigate the intense noise that our communities have been experiencing from planes serving Reagan National Airport. Many of those changes that created this situation and increased in intense noise were made by the Federal Aviation Administration in 2015, and our communities have joined representatives from communities around the region on the MWA Community Noise Working Group. Back in 2018, many of our community representatives and staff recognized that to make real progress, we would need the help of airspace experts who fully understood the technical details of designing and implementing airplane flight paths and procedures. This was largely because the recommendations coming out of the community working group to that time were being consistently rejected by the FAA on technical grounds. We also realized that we would need to work together with neighboring jurisdictions to come up with regional solutions. Board Member Karantonis, would you like to also make some introductory remarks?
Let me first unmute myself and welcome also everybody today. As you know, here in Arlington, of course, we recognize that this is a significant quality of life issue, and we know that it affects a lot of Arlingtonians. So we are very, very interested in to see how this study is progressing. And I think that this holistic joint approach has benefited both communities that started this study, and I'm looking forward to tonight's presentation. The pandemic, of course, caused a major decline in flight activity at Reagan National, and it has been quiet for a while. However, this decline has bottomed out, and we are seeing flight operations picking up and aircraft noise going back to pre-COVID levels. So those who were with us in previous community meetings will remember that we discussed the four components of this study: a baseline assessment of flight procedures, noise exposure, and population data prior to and following the changes of the FAA made in 2015, and then airspace and flight procedure design. The flight and flight procedure design and the airspace design that ABC ×2 will present to us in a few minutes, based on the underlying design philosophy of achieving fairness among impacted communities with input from those communities. So the procedures for arrivals that were previously presented to the community were already approved by the working group in October and are now reviewed by the FAA. So what comes next? Community engagement comes next. I mean, first of all, hearing what today's presentation, community engagement following that, including tonight's meeting, and finally advocacy implementation support. So I really am very interested to see what our consultants will be sharing with us tonight. And again, thank you for everybody for their thorough work on this, continuous work, and the members of the community that are participating and will also be sharing with their respective neighborhoods and communities further. Back to you, Rich.
Thank you very much, Board Member Karantonis. Just a reminder to everyone that this meeting is being recorded and will be available archived on YouTube after the fact. Councilmember Friedson, would you like to make any introductory remarks this evening? Oh. I believe you're muted, Mr. Friedson.
Mr. Reisman, just for to be very clear, my colleague Libby Garvey will be joining us very soon. We had a lengthy meeting day today, and she is on her way to her home from where she wants to join us. I very much hope that she will be with us very shortly.
Yes, understood. Thank you. Bear with us. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, I just called in, so I'm here. I'm called in, so hopefully this works. Let me know if it doesn't. But first of all, thank you. Apologies for the technical issues. I'm going back and forth between Zooms and Teams and having a little bit of issues, but such is life and our current realities. But just wanted to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is our third airplane noise mitigation study community meeting. So pleased to be joined by the Arlington County board members. Just heard, I could hear you. Apparently you couldn't hear me, but Takis, I did hear you, and great to partner with you and Libby Garvey and others as well. Great to be joined, I see, with Jim Alderdice and Jason Schwartz from our airplane noise consultant, and the study managers on both sides of the river, Montgomery County Director of Strategic Partnerships, Ken Hartman, and Regional Transportation Planning Program Coordinator, Rich Roisman from Arlington County. Thanks to both of you sincerely for all of your work. It really has been significant. Many of you here tonight have been following this issue of airplane noise impacting our communities and have been with us for many of these conversations when we kicked off the airplane noise study at our first meeting in August 2020 and at our second meeting back in April of this year. Just as a refresher and as background for anybody who wasn't able to join us previously, Montgomery and Arlington counties joined together to hire ABC ×2 as a consultant because of their airspace expertise to help us gather data and devise new flight paths and procedures to mitigate the intense noise our communities have been experiencing from planes arriving at and departing from Reagan National Airport. Many of the changes that created this increase in intense noise were made by the FAA in 2015, and our communities have joined representatives around the region on the Airports Community Noise Working Group. Back in 2018, many of the community representatives and staff recognized that in order to make real progress, we needed the help of airspace experts who really understood the technical details that we lacked of designing and implementing airplane flight paths and procedures. We also recognized that we need to work together with neighboring jurisdictions to come up with solutions that don't just move the noise problem from one place to another within our region, but that best mitigates and balances the noise for everybody in the community. As this study comes to its close in the spring, we reflect on the progress we've made on arrivals and what we still have to gain on departures, but we also note that there's much work that needs to be done to minimize airplane noise for our residents around the metropolitan region. These are regional problems. They do require regional solutions, and we look forward to working together to grow this coalition and make meaningful changes that benefit all of our residents. I do just quickly want to thank representatives from Senator Van Hollen's office, Brent Gerard, and I see Nina Weisbroth from Congressman Raskin's office for attending this evening. I know that they have been intimately involved, as have members of the Virginia congressional delegation who've really helped us with that. And lastly, just want to give a disclaimer up front that we know helicopter noise has been a recurring issue for many communities. Tonight's meeting and this study is about noise from airplanes coming to and from Reagan National Airport, but that is a significant issue as well that we've been working on, and I would be happy to address any concerns as they've often come up at these meetings, but aren't necessarily the work of this study and of this consultant. We have worked with our federal delegation. They've done really important work with the FAA, and I'd be happy to provide more detail or connect with you after the meeting if those are specific concerns that you have. So with that, thank you so much for allowing me to join again, for all the work that has gone into this, for everybody who's joined us, and I look forward to a really positive conversation.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Friedson. With that, I'm going to share out my screen for this evening's presentation and turn it over to Mr. Jim Allardyce of ABC X2, who is the study consultant for this work. Just a moment. Oh, I'm sorry, Ken, if you are leading off, you may go ahead. I have the presentation on screen. Everyone should be able to see it.
Thank you so much, Rich. I'll be quick since we've heard some from our elected officials, and for everyone, I'm Ken Hartman. I'm the chair of the North of Airport Committee for the Community Working Group at National Airport. I was one of the Community Working Group members 6 years ago, and we've had more than a dozen recommendations, as Rich alluded to, none of which were implemented, simply because they were not considered actionable by the FAA. And the members of the group back then, we realized, and we were told by the FAA, we simply could not advance the public dialogue without engaging a subject matter expert. So I greatly appreciate the work of ABCX2. The effectiveness of the North of Airport Committee has never been greater. With their help and their input, we were able to, and your input, folks in the public, we were able to develop the design philosophy that helps us review the consultant's recommendations. I'm sure Rich will put the website in the chat. The DCA NowGen website has all of our documents. We have successfully completed that comprehensive review of the airspace. Just remember this, when we started on the working group, none of us had any idea, and we had no technical expert to tell us exactly how the airspace had been changed, which led to so many complaints from our neighborhoods. We've done work with ABCX2 on approaches. Tonight, we're going to talk about departures. And I think it's important to note that there are other policy options that we've been in discussions with ABCX2 that we as a region should be focused in on. There are limitations. This process has educated us to the reality of the constraints out there. For example, one of the things we've learned, like the increase in the number of flights that depart early in the morning and wake everybody up, can't be solved with procedure design. There are other things we should be doing to address those problems. I'm looking forward to ABCX2's presentation. And before I go, I just want to make sure that I acknowledge the hard work of the North of Airport Committee. I'll read off the primary members of the committee from Arlington. We have Sherry Merrill and Steve Geiger. From Montgomery, along with myself, we have Janelle Wright and Bill Noonan. And from the District of Columbia, we have Richard Hines and Ken Buckley. And from Fairfax County, we have Jim Phelps. And all of us have alternates, and everyone has been engaged in this discussion. And again, we're looking forward to your feedback tonight. Thank you so much. Back to you, Rich.
Thank you. And with that, if everyone is able to see Jim's slides, then I will turn it over to Jim. Jim, can you see your slides?
Yes, sir. And
Excellent.
you can go ahead and advance it too, I think.
All right, just a moment.
So next thing on the agenda, background and project overview and progress to date that we've made, highlights of the notional procedures, next steps, and we'll end up with Q&A. So we're just going to get a little more background from Ken and Jason, and then go into talking about the community-based approach. So Ken, you want to do the background slide, which is the next slide, Rich?
Thank you, Jim. And I know we can tag team on this one. As I mentioned in my remarks, we did ask ABCX2 early on to work with us, the community working group, on strategies to minimize noise impacts. And that involves communities on both sides of the river. I think, as Rich mentioned early on, the FAA told us that they would not talk to each county individually. They only would talk to us as a region. And that means all the members of our working group from all the jurisdictions north of the airport. Our initial work on the committee focused on the arrivals and approaches. As I mentioned, we're currently focused on departures. Jason, do you want to go over the first few notes on the slide?
Sure. The one thing I wanted to mention about this process is, as was mentioned previously, there's been a lot of community concerns associated with the approaches and departures into and out of DCA. And I know that the FAA did a lot of work revising procedures over the years. We looked back to the 60s and we found that originally, way back, most of the activity was on the west side of the Potomac over Arlington. There's been historically a lot of switching back and forth, trying to get it closer to the Potomac. I think what differentiates this approach or this process from historical approaches is we really tried to make this community centric. So members of the NOAA were part of the design working group. And so folks actually got to participate in the design of the procedure. So we understood exactly what was requested. Also, early on, we started reaching out to the community through community conversations as well as a public survey to really understand what the community thinks would be the most fair approach to doing this. So we'll talk about this a little bit more later, this design philosophy. Basically we looked for regional input on what do you think collectively as a region would be the most fair approach to designing the procedures. And that's really the level of engagement that we're able to do on this project, I think, was greater than anything I've seen on a similar airspace or procedure design project in the U.S. So I've been really happy to be a part of that. As was also mentioned, this is a two-phase or two-component sort of project. First, we started with arrivals. We've got some recommendations on new arrival procedures, which are available on the website, which we'll provide links to. And then today, and the current focus of the work is on departures out of DCA. As I mentioned, probably one of the most important things and the differentiators on this project was that it was very community centric. Like I said, we went early and often to the community for input on what would be the most fair in terms of a regional approach or regional consensus on how to design these procedures. Obviously, and we said from the beginning, we can't necessarily reduce the total noise exposure, right? Because as long as there's airplanes, there's going to be noise. So really what we try to do is move that noise to where the region finds it most fair. So in a lot of cases, it was put it over the Potomac River where you can, or put it over industrial areas away from residential areas. So now we really tried to stick closely to what the community told us was the priorities that we should take. That community-centric approach really drove the entire process. Like I mentioned, the process all the way from the approach. We've done quite a bit of community engagement along the way, and that extended to the actual procedure design, where we had residents from the NOAA helping guide really where the lines were drawn as we were working through that process. The community consensus was the driver for the design philosophy, which again we'll get into a little bit more. And we also sought to really get informed and empowered participants, which means we provided subject matter expertise to the participants. So if something couldn't be done, if, for example, we wanted to move the procedure such that it got a little bit closer to the center of the river, but then we found it was too close to the protected airspace over the Capitol, we could explain that. Whereas historically, the FAA would maybe just tell you that it can't be done. Right. So we tried to really inform and empower the participants, and then also the community at large. They understood exactly what can and can't be done and why. And then, of course, a big part of this was ensuring transparency. So again, the community conversations, including that tonight, and we've got meeting summaries we compile for all these meetings to really keep the community informed and aware, really to the extent that they're interested in. If the more detailed you want, it's all available for the public to review and know exactly how we got to where we are.
And I just wanted to chime in here real quick on the empowerment of the community. One of the unique things in this project that we were able to achieve was representation of the community in what's called the Dot 41 Alpha meeting. That is the meeting that the FAA holds once recommendations have come in. And it's usually kind of a veil of secrecy, sort of. But what it is it has the FAA, it has the National Air Traffic Controllers Association representative there. It also has the airlines represented there, and many times the airport. But direct community representation in these meetings has been elusive until now. And we were able to I was the representative actually that went in there on behalf of the communities and the North of Airport Committee to represent them and explain basically everything about the recommendations that we had made. And on the arrival side, which you can go take a look on the website, the recommendation number 22 that we submitted to the airport, the entire thing so far has been approved and is moving through the implementation process. So that was an empowerment of the community that has, to my knowledge, never happened before. So next slide.
So thanks, Jim. In terms of scope and objective, like I said, the main objective of the project was to identify opportunities to optimize the flight procedures in and out of DCA while minimizing noise impacts for residents and the communities. Interestingly, we use the word optimize because, as I said, early in the 60s, you had procedures that were primarily over Arlington. There was the request from the community to put that over the center of the Potomac in order to, nobody lives right in the middle of the river. But then you've had shifting back and forth because anytime you get, if you move further from one community to get closer to the center of the river, you're moving it obviously to the opposite bank. So optimize is really the way that we've looked at this. Today's objectives are for the call today, the meeting today. We'll discuss the departure procedure design process that we've gone through, the constraints and the opportunities that were identified, and sort of the recommendations that we have as of now for revisions to existing departure procedures. Now, we'd like to obtain community feedback. That's really imperative. That's the primary reason for today, to get your feedback from the community's feedback on the designs. If they think, what y'all think about it. And most importantly, do you feel like it's consistent with the design philosophy that was agreed upon by the North of Airport Committee and the Community Working Group? And then finally, a presentation of the recommendations presentation to the CWG is planned for April, and at that point the CWG will determine or approve recommendations for submission to the Federal Aviation Administration. Next slide. So real quick, I don't want to take too much time on this, but a basic overview of our process. We broke it down into 4 components. The community involvement was really the foundation of the effort, as I've mentioned a couple of times now. We started with getting an understanding of the community concerns and the issues, including the existing and the historical flight procedures and the issues that evolved from those with the community. We used that to develop a design philosophy, which was based on feedback from the community. Then we did a baseline assessment. What the baseline assessment did was it allowed us to gain an understanding of the existing and historical conditions in terms of operational procedures, and then how we got to where we are today. So we did operational analyses, analysis of the fleet mix and the changes in fleet, changes in operational levels, things like that. And then we also looked really in depth at the community noise exposure and how that's changed and evolved over the last several years. And finally, an analysis of the community complaints. We looked at media coverage related to the airport, and also quite a bit of social media, because we were able to get a better understanding of the community's concerns through social media. The flight procedure design is pretty straightforward. That's designing the actual procedures and the revisions or proposals, recommendations to recommended changes to the procedures, again, based on that design philosophy. And finally, implementation. And all of the recommendations from the CWG that are developed will be presented to the FAA. They ultimately have to accept those, but part of our work involves working very closely with the airlines and the FAA to advocate for the community's interests and really encourage acceptance and implementation of the recommendations that are presented. Next slide, please.
All right. So I know we're throwing a lot of information at you all real fast here. So rest assured that these slides will also be posted on the website, so you can come back and refer to them later. The one thing that is the overarching principle of how we did or why we did what we did is the design philosophy. The design philosophy was informed by the North of Airport Committee and by the public in the 2 previous public conversations that we had. And we also went out with a community questionnaire that went out to the community early on in the process to get your feedback on the most important things that we should be looking at when we're designing procedures to be as fair as possible to the entire region. So the design philosophy was developed by the North of Airport Committee and based on your feedback, and it was approved by the community working group. And the intent of the philosophy was to establish a set of priorities and guidelines for how to design and or revise the flight procedures to reduce noise impacts in the fairest way possible, with a focus on a fair regional policy, big picture approach. So the top of the heap on the design philosophy is maximize overflight of compatible areas with the least impact on people, such as non-residential areas, commercial industrial areas, government-owned land, and the Potomac River corridor. So this philosophy is hierarchical in nature. So something below or secondary cannot bump something above it. It goes from the top down. Other considerations that we took into effect were design procedures that limit the exposure to any one area so that any one community is not disproportionately burdened. Design procedures that minimize noise exposure to the most impacted communities. Design procedures to avoid heavily populated residential areas. And consider historical flight tracks in recognition of the fact that people purchased their homes based on long-standing flight patterns until they were changed by Metroplex flight paths and other initiatives. So as we go through the presentation, I want you all to keep these in mind and refer back to them as the basis for the opinions that you send us. This is what we're looking to gauge our success. Did we successfully meet this design philosophy with the procedures that we're going to show you? So a little bit more history from the outcomes from phase one of the process, which is the arrival phase. And this is what I was telling you all about earlier, where we had submitted recommendations and they were actually being implemented. One of the things that we recommended was the advertisement of the Rnp approach, that's Required Navigational Performance Approach. It's the most high fidelity approach from the north that follows the river on the ATIS, which is the Automated Terminal Information System. So it's a broadcast that goes out to tell pilots what to expect to fly when they come into the airport. And so the default approach had been the LDA Zulu, which, as you all know, goes over quite a bit of a populated area. And so they're trying to encourage the use of the Rnp, which brings aircraft down the river. So that was implemented. The tower is doing that. So in the recommendations, we recommended that the Derrick waypoint be shifted to the southwest and moved the overflights from residential areas over compatible land, i.e. the CIA. So in doing that, we had pretty much of a win-win-win situation there. That solved some problems for the FAA as well, for the approach control. It solved some problems for the airlines as well, because now all the approaches are going to start at Derrick. It's a common point to start, and it gives them instrument guidance to the airport, which increases safety. And it provides a means to get some dispersion or some track variability for aircraft coming in on arrivals. So that was a big win for us. Proposed procedure designs include increased altitudes as compared to the existing procedure. That was one thing you asked us to look for. We were able to do that. And the design RNAV GPS approach, and it's based on the Rnp. So the problem with the Rnp is only about 40% or so airplanes today can actually fly that approach, because you have to have special qualifications to do that. Whereas the GPS approach will allow up to 95% plus of the airplanes that operate at DC to fly that. So it will allow the use of the LDA Zulu, which goes over very much highly densely populated area, to decrease, and the use of the river will be the predominant track coming into the airport. And we designed a new Rnp approach, and there it's basically an overlay of the GPS that we just described. And again, that allows all the approaches to the airport to start at a common point, and that's basically helpful to everyone, the airlines, the FAA, and the community. Next slide, please. So in this component, we were asked to analyze the north flow departures and identify community concerns and issues and impacts, engage the public to understand the community concerns associated with existing departure procedures. And when we say existing, now we are talking about the departure procedures that were implemented December 31st, 2020, so about a year ago. And we were to work with collaboration with the NOAA and the CWG to identify changes to existing procedures that address the community concerns and are consistent with the design philosophy. So I'm gonna drill down hard on that for most of this presentation, because that was our guiding principle. And then we're going to present the recommendations to the community tonight and collect input and make necessary changes. So as we get feedback from you from what you're about to see, it will inform the North of Airport Committee going forward. And then if any changes are required, then we will address those. So next slide, please. So from a historical perspective, you started out with the National 7. National 7 is a conventional departure. It is ground-based. In other words, it's based on ground-based navigational equipment. It basically took airplanes a sharp left turn off the airport, right over the west side, down over Roslyn and Arlington up, and then finally get back to the river up to the northwest. When the FAA decided that they were going to implement the next phase or next gen procedures, the first thing they implemented was the laser. Next slide, please. The laser was the first departure procedure to actually attempt to navigate along the river. That brought its own set of issues with it. And also, as they progressed, there were some other concerns that were happening, namely aircraft departing the airport were all too often penetrating the prohibited airspace over the Capitol. And so the Holt B, which is on the next slide, was developed, and that shifted the noise back to the west from over that intersection that you can see basically there in the orange called ADAX. It shifted it to the west a little bit at Roslyn, and the new intersection is called RevG. And that was in an attempt to reduce the incursions of the prohibited airspace. Next slide, please. So this is the existing condition today that we're taking a look at. I'd like to note that as of right now, there are no recommendations to change anything going west. As of 12/31 last year, the westbound departures pretty much go along the river out to the west and over compatible land out that way, and that is working pretty well. The only thing that we're trying to change is from the airport out to the northwest and then where it bends back to the northeast. The three SIDS that are involved are the Sookie, the Doctor, and the Amy, and we're going to talk about each of those as we go forward tonight. Next slide, please. So we talked about the incursions into the prohibited areas being a big concern for the Secret Service, who talked to the FAA, and that's why they had to move the SIDS slightly to the west. And so coming off the airport and making that initial turn was a big area of concern for the agency, and they're loath to try to change that. However, one of the things that we wanted to do was at that intersection that says Bevel or Beeble, ABCX2, we wanted to move that waypoint slightly back to the southeast. And the reason we wanted to do that was it put that waypoint closer to compatible land. Now, this is a good time to pause and remind you that what you are looking at now is the actual flight procedure design. It is not the flight path that the airplanes will take. The airplanes will actually take a more slightly curved path, and I'm going to show you that here in just a little bit, because these are what are called flyby waypoints. So don't get this confused with where the airplanes are going to fly. This is the underlying procedure, and we'll show you the flight path. But we also wanted to show you this more technical detail, because this is what the criteria is based on that we have to comply with. So the move of Bevel to the southeast also said the leg length between Bevel and RevG, that new waypoint down there by the prohibited area, was now too short. So the only way we could do it is to extend that leg length slightly, which resulted in RevG moving about halfway back to where it was at ADAX. So that also put that new waypoint just slightly closer to the river and just slightly further away from Roslyn than what the current waypoint is. Now, our hope is that when we present this to the FAA, that they will understand that this move was made to stay within criteria, but yet does not increase the threat to the prohibited area, in our opinion. And so, we'll have to have that discussion with them. I'm sure they're going to have that discussion with the Secret Service. So we're keeping our fingers crossed on a positive outcome from there. Then to the northwest of Beeble, we made a slight adjustment as well. You can go to the next slide. And let me just say one other thing on the previous slide. The shifted flight path closer to the center of the river at Beeble, and that is further from or into compatible land. That is in accordance with one of the design philosophy principles. So anyway, next one. So we talked about the westbound departures, and the track that the westbound departures currently take is this green line between Beeble ABCX2 and Alex. And then they peel off as the river turns to the west. They peel off to the west. But the path or the course that they take between Beeble and Alex is the same. So that intersection Cobtoe is not there on the westbound departures. So what we're recommending is to move that red line there at Cobtoe slightly back to the east. It's still along the west edge of the river. It puts that line slightly more towards compatible land, which is the river, and slightly further away from the residences on the west bank. Again, in accordance with the design philosophy to try to keep the design over compatible land as much as possible. And also, in this case, it says design procedures that limit the exposure to any area, to any one area, so that no one community is disproportionately burdened, and reduce concentration of overflights of communities below the existing. So the other piece of this is you kind of looked at population density, which also refers back to the design philosophy. And the reason it's on the west edge of the river, because the west edge is less dense than the east edge of the river there. So overcompatible land and fairly distributed amongst populations. So next slide. Now we're coming up around the corner. Another piece of the design philosophy is that no one community bears all the burden. So what we looked at doing here was trying to split the tracks going up to the northwest at Alex. So there would be an inside track and an outside track. So today, if you follow the red lines, you see that they come around, and there is a split of the red lines at that Dougie or Doge, however you want to say it, intersection. And that Sookie is the SID that goes off to the north. Well, Sookie has about 50% of the flights that take to go to these northeast departures. And if you take the Sookie track and split it off there at Alex to the northwest, now you've about split the burden there between the inner track and the outer track. And you give some relief to the folks inside that red track when they're flying the green track, and you give some relief to the folks outside that green track when they're flying the red track. So I'll show you another slide coming up here that makes that a little bit more evident. But again, this is trying to share the wealth, kind of. So this is the proposed revision in its entirety as the actual procedure design looks. The procedure is within criteria. It was designed as closely as possible within the design philosophy, we believe. That's what you guys are going to give us the feedback on tonight. And then what we did after that was take a look at what the flight path differences are. Now, remember what we talked about at each one of those waypoints. An airplane does what is called turn anticipation. So it sees where that point is, and it figures out how to navigate by that point. It flies by that point. So they aren't just, and you can go to the next slide. they aren't just, and you can go to the next slide. And they aren't just those real sharp corners. What they are is they're smoothed routes, is the way the airplanes actually fly. And this is a little hard to see on this presentation, but the current route for the Amy SID is the darker blue, and the magenta is the proposed route. And you can see, as we talked about at Roslyn, where that lighter magenta line is wider, is further towards the river, and gives a little bit more space from communities at Roslyn. Pretty much as you pass the reservoir there, they're coincidental. And then as you go upstream, they're very, very close to being coincidental going upstream as well. Next slide, please. Further upstream, you stay over the west edge or the west bank of the river, and then over the compatible land there at the CIA before the new tracks turn more towards the north. And then you can go to the next slide. This is the wide view of all three of the SIDs. So the SIDs, the blue line to the west is the Sookie. The pink line is the Amy, and actually that little kind of light blue or maybe even teal line going out to the east is the other SID called the Doctor. And I'll say again, Amy and Doctor, the pink line and the teal line going east combined have about 50% of the departures that go to the east. And Sookie has about the other 50%. So we believe that was a very even split between the inner track and the outer track, and that's why we split that way. All right, next slide. One of the things that we were asked to take a look at was the vertical profile of the aircraft departing the airport. And as you could see, based on design criteria and the design philosophy, there wasn't a lot we could do to move the SIDs laterally to affect a change in noise that would be, absolutely noticeable. However, in the vertical profile, aircraft today generally, if no other advice is given, default to what is called NADP2 climb performance, which is a noise abatement departure procedure. And the noise abatement departure procedures are standard climb outs that the aircraft use, that all the aircraft are aware of. All the pilots know how to do it. They're programmed into their flight management systems as standard climb profiles. So what we took was a look at NADP2 versus NADP1. The difference is that normally NADP2 is more noise friendly further away from the airport, and NADP1 is more noise friendly closer into the airport. In this case, I know this slide is pretty busy, but if you take a look at where the box is pointing to NADP1, what that shows, as opposed to the peak at NADP2, that's the 75 dB contour line, and it is pulled back in closer to the airport. So there's up to a 5 decibel difference by switching to NADP1 versus NADP2 over Roslyn. And everything within that contour line around to the outside would also be positively affected. Now, further, the next slide gives you a little bit better overall picture of the effect of this. And yeah, there you go. So same thing here. All right. This is not the actual value of the noise. This is the delta, or the difference of the noise compared to the procedures as they're being flown today, compared to the procedures as we're recommending them to be flown. And if adopt NADP1 and the flight procedure changes that we're recommending, this is the layout that you get of the difference of the noise with the NADP1 climb. And you'll see that the vast majority of the benefit here is derived from those living closest to the river. Now, I caveat this with the fact that anything less than a 3 decibel change is probably not perceptible to the human ear. And many of these dots that you see on this, when you get the chance to really zoom in and take a look at it, are way less than 3 decibel changes. However, in close to the airport, there are some that are as much as 7 decibel changes, which, in other words, like, and Rich, tell me again what that bridge was. My DCA geography is not as good as it should be.
That is the Theodore Roosevelt Memorial Bridge.
So there's a dot right over that bridge that says that you get a 7 dB reduction in sound over that. And there's a few other places that you do get 3s, 4s, and 5s along that corridor along the river going up by switching to the NADP1 vertical profile as they leave. So this is demonstrable relief for the folks that live right along the river. And that is also consistent with the design philosophy that says design procedures to minimize the noise exposure to the most impacted communities. So since all of these procedures, arrivals and departures, are pretty much tried to be flown along the river corridor, this actually provides some relief to that most impacted set of communities that live close to the river. So we thought that was a pretty good, pretty significant win. The next slide, please.
Sorry, Jim. Before you go on to the next slide, I actually need to correct myself. The location of that noise monitor that you're talking about is actually the Arlington Memorial Bridge connecting Arlington National Cemetery with the Lincoln Memorial. I'm sorry for that.
It's all right. I wouldn't have known. Don't get up there that much. All right, here we go. The next slide. So we discussed the splitting of the two procedures. So these lines represent the projected flight paths of the airplane, and where they split is close to that intersection, that Alex intersection that we talked about. So in this slide, if an aircraft is initially flying the AMI procedure, which is on the inner arc, and the SID were switched to the SUKI or outer arc departure, this would be the resultant effect of the noise. So what you're looking at here again is the delta, the difference in noise, not the absolute noise value. As you get further up and around the corner, the actual noise value in LA Max, which is just a single airplane, the loudest it's going to be in a single event, is below 65 dB and even 60 or below as you get around the corner, because they're getting close to being above 10,000 feet out there. So the actual dB level is starting to come down. But the difference in the noise between the two procedures is illustrated here. Now you have some that are very minimal here as well, but further away from the procedure, as the noise attenuates, you also can get 3s, 4s, and 5s out there as well. So this would give some relief by sharing the burden basically, and putting 50% on the outer track and 50% on the inner track. It would give an overall noise reduction inside around Bethesda and even some towards Silver Spring when the aircraft are flying that outer track. But then to the community's northwest, North Bethesda and to the northwest of that, when those airplanes are flying the outer track, they see a disbenefit. Now flip it. So next slide. If you flip it, if an aircraft that is flying the outer SID now flies the inner SID, and this was all done based on a Boeing 737-800, which is a very common aircraft that is flown out of DCA. But if you flip it from the outside to the inside, then you see it flip back the other way. So now all the airplanes that are flying on the inner track are going to make more noise for the folks at Bethesda and and Silver Spring and stuff. But the folks on the outside track out there are going to get a benefit when the airplanes are actually flying the inner track. So again, this is the part of the design philosophy that says no one community should bear the whole burden. So we tried to do some work with track diversity on the arrivals. This is our attempt to do some work on track diversity on the departures to give some dispersion to the departures, but yet still stay within FAA criteria and the types of procedures that they would like to use. All right, or need to use or require to use. So Jason, you want to start on this one?
Sure. So we were also asked, in addition to the procedure and the airspace design changes, what other steps could be taken sort of moving forward after the procedure work is done. We came up with 4 potential further actions. First, developing a fly quiet program for DCA. Basically, a fly quiet program involves monitoring conformance to noise abatement program elements. So in the context that we're discussing today, we would be, or MWA would be, monitoring use of the preferred procedures, the preferred noise abatement procedures. Then first typically you report that publicly. So perhaps the community working group would be briefed on the results. That could also be done publicly. So that gives the public the opportunity to really understand what's going on. How are the airlines and air traffic control conforming in terms of the recommended noise abatement procedures? That also can be used to engage air traffic control and the airlines to talk with them about any performance concerns. So if you see that some of the preferential procedures aren't being used, you can engage those airlines and find out why and see if there's ways that performance can be improved. Updating the Part 150 study was another potential future action. The Part 150 study is basically an FAA program where airports can do a noise analysis of the noise exposure associated with their with airport operations, and then come up with noise abatement and mitigation strategies, which some of which would be funded or fundable by the FAA. So DCA did a Part 150 update in 2004. That with the amount of time that's gone by and the change in operations, fleet mix, flight procedures, including Metroplex, or maybe especially Metroplex, a Part 150 may be helpful in identifying opportunities based on current conditions of ways that noise can be further mitigated or reduced. We've talked about a north-south flow, sort of a split 50-50. So the idea there is when airplanes are departing to the north and arriving from the south going north, there's a certain amount of noise exposure. And so if you could flip that, so half the time you're departing to the north and half the time you're departing to the south, the idea there is that you would sort of equalize the noise exposure to the north communities and then to the south communities. There's a number of operational or potential operational constraints there that would have to be overcome with the FAA, but that's a potential that can be looked at. And finally, Rnp overlays of the RNAV SIDS. That's kind of a lot of technical jargon. Basically what that means is Jim showed you some of the procedure designs that are proposed, and you can see that they're kind of gradual turns back and forth to try to follow the river. The Potomac, as you guys know better than I do, is fairly thin in certain spots, and it's fairly windy. And aircraft using the technology that we're proposing for today really can't follow the curvature of the river. If you were to put Rnp on there, that's just a fancy way of saying better precision in the navigation. So the aircraft could hypothetically follow those curves much more closely, keeping them either over the center of the river or over compatible areas. If you've got industrial residential or non-residential areas, we could follow those much more closely. Unfortunately, right now at DCA, most of the aircraft couldn't use those procedures or that technology. So discussions with the FAA have indicated that it's not something that the FAA would be willing to look at for right now. But potentially, and I would expect that over the years, the next several years, more RMP use would be available and the fleet would be able to follow that. And so that could be something to look at in the future.
Yeah, and early on in this discussion, I told you about that DOT 41 Alpha meeting that I was able to attend with the FAA, the design meeting. In that meeting, one of the PBN co-leads, it's performance-based navigation co-leads in the region, talked to me about Rnp departures. And he informed me that there are issues with those in the NAS right now. So there's only like 2 or 3 facilities that are even using them right now. But due to certain constraints, which I won't delve into, it's not possible to automate those departures as in issue those departures to the pilots automatically. All that has to be done manually by the controllers. And so due to that workload and the fact that they don't have the automation to do it, to assign it, they have suspended the use of the Rnp SIDs at several of the airports. And they said that they would not be willing to consider any new Rnp SIDs at this time until they get the automation issues addressed and fixed and implemented at the facilities that already have them. So although there is, we could design an Rnp SID that more closely matches the river, there was really no point in going down that road at this time because the FAA has already said that they are not willing to entertain them at this time. So this would be a definite future issue that you would want to revisit. But we wanted to make recommendations that are implementable in the near term. And this is just unfortunately not one of them. So, lastly, the next step is after we get the input from you all tonight, the NOAA will take all that input and review it. They will, in collaboration with us, see if there's any other potential revisions that can be done based on community feedback that we got. And we'll review the proposed final designs by the community working group in April, like we told you there. So if you have comments, this is the email address to send your comments to noise2020@arlingtonva.us. That's on our website as well. And I believe it's also on the last slide there. And I believe that's all we have. And there's the project website as well, the dca.nowgen.net. That website has everything that we've ever done in this project on it. So those are the two email address and website address that will give you the information about the project and an opportunity to give your input as well as what is done tonight. So I guess we go to back to Rich. You're muted, Rich.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason, Jim, and Ken. I want to make sure we get to as many questions as possible during the time remaining. Let me first point out 2 things. First of all, as Jim mentioned, these recommendations are still undergoing review. That includes the feedback that we get from everyone in the community this evening. These recommendations have not yet been endorsed by the North of Airport Committee or the full community working group. As Jim notes, this plan is to go to them with an information item in January and then again in April if action is going to be taken. The other thing that I want to say before we pull in the question and answers, and I will be directing those to our panelists, is that if we don't get to your question this evening, do not be concerned. We will provide a table of all questions with answers to be posted to both the project website and to the county's aircraft noise webpage following the close of the public comment period on January 12th. And again, if there's something we don't get to this evening that is not already captured in the chat, you can email those questions and comments to noise2020, that's all one word, at arlingtonva, all one word, .us. Let me turn now to questions and answers. The first one I'm going to put to, well, I'll try it with Ken first, or possibly Jim. When is the presentation to the FAA, and how can people attend? I think that really means the presentation to the MWA Community Working Group. So whoever would like to field that one, please go ahead.
Thanks, Rich. I'll jump in. The Community Working Group meets quarterly. We, as a committee in January, will be meeting to discuss the feedback we've received tonight, the proposals put forward by Jim, as well as some of the long-range options. One thing that's clear from the presentation and from the proposals from ABCX2 is that the benefits of moving the lines around, the procedures around laterally, are small. And there are some other options that we've talked about, such as the Fly Quiet program, the looking forward at a Part 150 and other recommendations on that last slide that Jason went over, are things that we should also be talking about. So that whatever the committee does in January, we're looking for a discussion with the Community Working Group in April. Those meetings are on Zoom. There is a website and that we'll post in the chat at the DCA National Airport website that has links to all of our minutes of past meetings, all of the presentations, and links to upcoming meetings so that the public can participate virtually.
Thank you, Ken. And we'll put that link to the MWA website in the chat window shortly. While we're doing that, another question, I think this one for Jim Allardyce. What are the expectations of pilots to fly the aircraft according to these flight paths, and what happens if they fail to do that?
So when the aircraft are flying these procedures, the criteria under which they fly is called RNAV1. RNAV1 actually allows the airplanes to be up to a mile either side of the center line of the course. However, the good news is generally they're within a quarter to a third of the mile. And so they're fairly accurate going up the river. If an aircraft were to deviate outside of that mile, that's part of the reason why we were talking about this Fly Quiet program, to make sure that we're monitoring that and to make sure that if those things happen and there's no regulatory or enforcement action that can be taken because they didn't violate an FAR, but yet they're not performing as good as expected on the procedure, at least we can approach the airline and say, hey, we've noticed on several flights that you're flying kind of outside the norm, and hopefully we can give incentives for them to get back into the main grouping of the other aircraft. So if the aircraft deviates like way off course, then there could be enforcement action taken against the pilot by the FAA.
Thank you. Next question. What is the time window for flights at DCA? Resident or community members noted that flights sometimes go past 10 p.m. and they've heard flights cover their area at 2 a.m. or before 5:30 a.m.
Rich, I can jump in.
Thank you.
So there are no time limits for flights coming into the airport. There are weight restrictions after a certain time at night and before a certain time in the morning, where if a plane comes in and it's over the rated weight, they can be fined. That does not mean that they can't come, they can't land, or can't take off. So I know in the past we talked about, is there a curfew or is there not? And the answer is there is not a curfew at National Airport.
Thank you. Question has there been a noise level difference between the start of the COVID-19 pandemic and today, given that passenger rates and flight activities are now returning to pre-COVID levels? I think we addressed that on the introduction, but just to clarify, yes, there is. At the low point during COVID-19 pandemic, I think the National Airport was operating roughly 20% of pre-COVID levels. It's a significant reduction in the hundreds of daily flights that are there. As we noted, they are now approaching pre-COVID flight levels, and so the noise has increased back to close to 2019 conditions. Let's see. How are waivers granted for flight distance limitations at National Airport, and who is responsible for issuing them? And I think this is related to the so-called perimeter rule, which we did not talk about in any detail, but I will try to answer that. Many people on the call know that National is subject to a series of regulations combined called the slot and perimeter rules. The slots govern the number of daily and hourly takeoffs and landings that are allowed at the airport. The perimeter rule governs any flight beyond 1,250 miles, nautical miles away from the airport. Longer distance flights beyond that are encoded in federal law. They are part of the FAA authorization. There are a handful of so-called perimeter exempt flights that serve mostly far western destinations, the west coast of the United States, as well as Phoenix and Las Vegas. Those regulations are subject to the United States Congress. And periodically, when there is an FAA authorization, there are attempts to weaken those by allowing more perimeter exempt flights. Arlington County, Montgomery County, in fact, the entire region, as well as the Airports Authority, has acted in concert previously to resist those changes. The region has a 3-airport regional system that works in balance. Long-distance flights, for the most part, are for Baltimore, Washington, Thurgood Marshall Airport in Maryland, and Washington Dulles International Airport out to the west, bordering Fairfax and the border of Fairfax and Loudoun counties. So we will continue to oppose further attempts to increase more beyond perimeter flights at DCA because it simply doesn't make sense given the airport system that is in place. Let's see. Has there been thought given to an approach that distributes the noise throughout the region? I'm going to ask either Jim or Ken to tackle that one.
Well, yes. So throughout the region, the approach that that we did do that on, as I said earlier, was the approaches that started Derrick. Now, distribute throughout the region in close to the airport. That gets a little sticky criteria-wise because there's segments of the approach, and the aircraft can't join inside of an intermediate segment. That I know that sounds very technical, but the beginning of the intermediate segment will be Derrick, which will be in the vicinity of the CIA. So when the weather is bad, you can't join an approach in any closer than that. So outside of that, yes, we have achieved some dispersion in a test that we ran, and we are absolutely confident that once all the procedures are amended and start at Derrick, and the standard terminal arrival route that comes in from the northwest is disconnected from that, and all aircraft are required to be cleared direct to Derrick, that will increase the amount of dispersion from Derrick out. Unfortunately, just because of the rules and the criteria from Derrick in, there's not a lot we can do.
Thank you. Next question is from an airline pilot. Thank you for joining us. Asks if any pilots, either general aviation or military, have been involved in this project. I will start to answer that and then can turn it over to someone else to fill in any details. My understanding is that general aviation presence at National itself is very little, if not none, at this point. And so there's not a lot of general aviation traffic within the approaches to and from National. As for military, most of the military overflights, the National Tower or the Potomac TRACON, the air traffic controllers, work those in. Obviously, there's significant military presence here between Joint Base Andrews and the other facilities around there. They have not been, no pilots for general aviation or military have been directly involved in this project. However, the community working group of the Airports Authority has representatives of the airlines there, and they are in communication with their own pilots about the recommendations that come forth from this study as they go to the community working group. If anyone would like to add to that, please chime in. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next question.
Yeah, and I'll tag on to that too, Rich. Specifically, American Airlines was very involved in the development and support for the RNAV GPS approach that was designed in this process. So they have been integral to this process from the flyability side of it. They've done some flights in their simulators to make sure that it was flyable and safe for their fleets. And they have also been very supportive of it because it provides them a higher level of precision guidance to the airport than they currently have on the visual approach, but yet allows more of their fleet to fly it than can fly just the RNP. So American is, and the other airlines that have talked with them are very interested in the implementation of that, and they have been involved in it from that standpoint, yes.
All right, thank you, Jim. Question asking about the safety of protected airspaces. I think they mean the prohibited airspaces, and if there could be any harmful impacts of aircrafts that might be able to reach that airspace.
Well, yes, that was the impetus for the change in the first place, was the prohibited airspace and aircraft that would fly off course and penetrate that airspace. And again, that would be one of those cases where enforcement action would be taken against the pilot and or the airline. So that was the impetus for the change in the procedure that moved the waypoint west from the old one ADAX to the new one RevG, which was closer to Roslyn. And so there is definite concern about that. And as we discussed, our proposal moves that waypoint back a little bit closer to the prohibited airspace, but not all the way back. So we're hopeful, and we believe that it provides enough of a buffer from that airspace that it shouldn't be an issue. However, the FAA and the Secret Service will both have something to say about that. So,
thank you, Jim. Next question is about timeline for recommendations and implementation. When might we expect the pilots to actually begin using the new profiles if they are accepted by the FAA? And Jim, I know you can speak to a definitive timeline, given that the FAA is currently reviewing the recommendation 22 of the CWG for arrivals. But if you can address both that and a potential timeline for the standard instrument departures if they are implemented by the FAA, please.
So usually the FAA standard line is 18 to 24 months from the time that they accept the recommendation. That is caveated by other safety factors that are involved. In other words, if another procedure at another airport is a higher safety concern, that might take the place or bump, the implementation of one of these approaches. The other thing is national projects. There's a national project called the VOR MON, and what that is it's a minimum operating network of ground-based navigational aids, and they're decommissioning a bunch of those, which requires procedures to be redesigned all over the eastern seaboard in particular. And that is a very high priority. So trying to get into line to get your procedures published is subordinate to that. So there's a lot of factors that go into it, but generally speaking, development is 18 to 24 months, but there's a lot of caveats to things that could make it beyond that.
Thank you. Next question. Someone wants to know if the recent expansion of Reagan National Airport will result in exponentially more airplanes and noise. I think they're referring to the Project Journey which is a multi-billion-dollar investment by the Airports Authority to add a new regional jet terminal just north to the far north end of the airport, as well as change the configuration of the security checkpoints. There was a ribbon cutting for that event not long ago, and my recollection is that Congressman Beyer, who has been an effective partner with us in helping to mitigate aircraft noise, stated that it would not. And I don't want to speak for the Airports Authority, but my understanding is that the Project Journey gate expansion was largely replacing parking spaces for the regional jets that were on the tarmac rather than having actual gates. If anyone remembers the infamous gate 35X at National Airport, where you went downstairs and waited for your van and then were bussed out to your plane and sometimes walked on the tarmac to get onto your aircraft, this now puts a gate structure in place that replaces that. It is not necessarily adding new capacity at the airport itself. So that if that is the case, it should not result in additional airplanes and noise just based on the implementation of Project Journey.
Yeah, and just one other thing I'll add on to that. Basically, airport capacity is based on concrete. And the way that the national airport is set up and the way that the operation is run there is a finite number of airplanes that can arrive and depart of that airport. The north-south runway is the primary runway. Most of the time, that runway is shared between arrivals and departures. So given that, there's a finite number of airplanes that you can squeeze in and out of the airport at any given time. Now, in good weather, they do use the crossing runways some, but it does not add significantly to the capacity of the airport. So you're, in my estimation, the pre-2019 arrivals and departures capacity, you're pretty close to about 90% of what the airport can really actually handle. So there's not a lot more capacity that they can do above and beyond the 2019 traffic levels.
Thank you for that, Jim. Let me also add from a regional airport system standpoint that there are significant capacity constraints, both physical and operationally at National, whereas Dulles and BWI both have room to expand. So I'm going to do one or two more questions, and then we'll be coming up on 5 before 8 o'clock, and the event ends at 8. So I do want to stop at that point to make sure that we allow people closing remarks, particularly from our elected officials. So let me do one or two more. Question of whether or not we should consider NADP 1 or 2 departures specific to aircraft type. Jim, if you'd like to address that, please.
Yeah, so overall, the model is expected to be similar for all aircraft types. The recommendation that we would make is that the MWA make that the preferred departure profile for the airport, that it be put into their airport facility directory, and that all airlines be informed that this is the preferred departure profile. It would not be mandatory, unfortunately, but it would be well publicized, and virtually all aircraft types can fly that. I believe that, is there going to be some slight differences based on aircraft type? Yes, but it would really take extensive modeling to do that, and the product that you would get out really wouldn't be worth the time and money that you'd have to put in to figure it all out. So the model that we did was general in nature, and we believe that it is very representative of no matter what aircraft type.
Thank you, Jim. With that, let me just say that again, if we didn't get to your question this evening, we will get to it. We will post a complete record of all questions received during this meeting and responses to them, most likely following the end of the public comment period on January 12th. So we make sure that we get everything that comes in before that time. That will be posted to both the project website as well as to both county websites. With that, let me ask Board Member Garvey, who was not able to provide introductory remarks, if she'd like to lead off some closing remarks this evening.
Sure. Thank you so much, Rich. Mostly thank you. Jason, Jim, Ken, Rich, thank you so very much. I really appreciated the opening remarks from Jim saying that we've found out what's happening, actually. And that's been part of the problem. It's been in a black box. It's been one of the most absolutely frustrating things for everybody to deal with. And what we can and can't do about it, what can and can't be done, and why, and who is responsible. That is a tremendous, advance. I know it doesn't feel like it to a lot of people. I feel like once we get this report out and done and finish this part of it, that will be probably the end of the beginning of what's going to be a really long effort. And I think it will be clear how much what we can do is technical and how much is political. And I think a lot of it probably is going to be political, but we're now armed with good information to help us do that. Thank you. And then I'll pass it back to you, Rich, or maybe to Andrew. I don't know if you were able to make introductory remarks or had anything to say, and obviously my colleague Takas.
Thank you, Libby. Yes, Councilmember Friedson, if you'd like to make any closing remarks, please go ahead. We need to call back in. While Councilmember Friedson is calling back in, let me give the floor to Board Member Karantonis for any closing remarks from him.
Thank you. Very similar. First of all, thank you everybody for a very thorough presentation. I would love to go back and look at some of these slides again. I am sure that all of us will look very closely at your work, and there's huge interest in that, and logically so. So I'm happy to do that in partnership with our friends in Montgomery County. I look forward in closing this. As my colleague Libby Garvey said, this end of the beginning, I definitely see where the next steps might get us in working at first with our citizens, the affected residents, upstream Potomac River and the North Flow, and consolidating our arguments and trying to convince those who really have a lot of power of decision, a lot of influence in this process. I'm very happy to have representatives of congressional offices here tonight, and we will be working with our Virginia delegation as well. You can rest assured that we will be doing that in collaboration with everybody affected. Thanks again, and have a good night, and we'll keep in touch.
Thank you, Board Member Karantonis. Councilmember Friedson, you have the final word this evening.
I appreciate it. Though I have struggled mightily to connect with you, I have listened the entire time, and just wanted to express my appreciation to Libby and Takas in particular, and then Jim, Jason, Rich, Ken. I really appreciate all the efforts here. Pleased to have a regional coordination, really appreciative of our federal delegations and their efforts. This certainly isn't one entity working by itself. This is a regional approach to a regional challenge. It's about quality of life. It's about health and wellness. I mean, this is a wide-ranging issue. I think we've made considerable progress, and as long as this isn't the beginning of our collective end, it's the end of the beginning. I think it's hard when you have a huge challenge like this and a far-off federal agency that isn't far away from us, and yet sometimes feels that way, to be able to make considerable progress. But I think we're moving forward. I think we have a lot of work left to do, but just really appreciate everybody's efforts here. And I also want to thank all the residents, not just for showing up tonight, but this has from the beginning really been a resident-led effort, really pushing us to understand what the challenges are with this issue and how we can move forward. And now we've gone from a grassroots effort to really bring in the type of expertise that we need and have always needed to really be able to figure out these issues that go well beyond my capabilities and understanding, and frankly, I think the capabilities of any local government that really isn't equipped to handle these types of things. So thanks to the team. It feels a lot better today than it did before we had the expertise on board. I recognize that there's some impatience and concern that we haven't been able to solve all of our issues related to this, but I do think we're moving in a positive direction. We have more work to do, and I look forward to being able to work with everybody on this call and beyond to be able to move it forward. So thank you. Be healthy, be well. Hope you have some quiet time this holiday season. I kind of bite my lip as I say that, and just wanted to express appreciation to everybody and wish you happy holidays.
Thanks very much, Councilmember Friesen. And with that, the evening is over. Thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to your continued comments on the aircraft noise mitigation study. Thank you and good night.
Thanks, everybody. Happy holidays.